Okay, so again, welcome to this class of this series that we've been working with Nagarjuna's text, Fundamental Wisdom. So just as a reminder, we did finish the text, the chapters that we were working with in last week's class. So tonight and the next few nights will be some meditation on emptiness, using some of the verses that we had in that text as the platform for going into a meditation on emptiness. So it will still be a teaching. The first part of it, I will go over the technique that we're using. Tonight it'll be the 4-point analysis. And so I'll go through all of that and we'll discuss that a little bit, and then we'll do a short meditation together on that. So again, let's go ahead and start with our prayers as we usually do. We're going to recite the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. Tonight, let's just do this once in that prayer, and then we'll go on to the short mandala offering and so on. So let's see. Gotta get this out of the way on my screen. Okay. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then we'll do the short mandala offering, again imagining the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful Buddha paradise, free of any faults, defects, illnesses, everything. A completely pure land that represents our own future realm of enlightenment, as well as the realm that all beings can attain through practicing the path. So we're making this vast pure offering in order to accomplish that, to receive the blessings of the holy beings so we can become just like them, living in such a pure land. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. We'll do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sunam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sunam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the short meditation. Again, we're going to do a longer meditation tonight on emptiness, but as long as we need to kind of focus our minds a bit, set a good intention. So we're going to do that first to start with. So just find a good meditation posture, one that works for your body, but where the back is somewhat upright and straight. And then relaxing into this posture, releasing tension as best as you can. And breathing naturally, begin to attend to the breath. Again, if you have a technique you already use, you can do that. If not, once more, I generally suggest working with a sensation in the area of the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and out, and just staying focused on that sensation that occurs in that area. Trying not to let the mind wander, but when the mind does wander, there's no need for any judgment. We simply acknowledge that the mind has lost the meditation object, and can even label whatever it was that distracted you, thoughts of planning or thoughts of remembering or worries, what have you. And then, of course, returning to the breath, you establish your attention once more and continue until the next time you notice that the mind has wandered away. So let's do a few minutes in silence doing a meditation on the breath, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the bell to begin the meditation period. So now let's set our motivation for tonight's class and meditation. And we can't help but be reminded by what's all going on in our world of the nature of cyclic existence, that what we are witnessing, what we are seeing, is a product of this state that we are in under the control of our karma and our delusions. And it should break our hearts when we see this going on in our world and all the beings that are being impacted in such suffering ways, because the suffering essentially is unnecessary. This is what the Buddha is teaching and what Nagarjuna was expounding upon, is that if we were able to correct our minds at the deepest level through understanding the nature of reality, all of the suffering would disappear. All of the suffering would no longer have its causes, because the root cause, the primary cause, is the ignorance within our own minds, especially the one that clings to the strong sense of a self, thinking that we exist in some independent, substantial way. And on the basis of that ignorance, we engage in unhealthy states of mind. And we simply keep creating the causes through our mental states, through the karma that follows from that, to experience these various realms of existence, to have these experiences of suffering in all the variety of ways that dukkha, dissatisfaction, appears. So when we understand this for ourselves, it leads to the mind of renunciation, the mind that desires to turn away from the habitual patterns we've been involved in and to seek liberation, to want to attain a state where we're no longer under the control of all the various factors that cause our suffering, but especially the ignorance that is the root. And then when we look at other sentient beings, it becomes the cause for bodhicitta, the cause for us to develop our minds and our hearts fully to the state of Buddhahood, so we can then help all beings to be liberated from their suffering, to find the peace, the happiness that they seek. So we see that this topic we're delving into tonight, in terms of this meditation on emptiness we're going to go through and do together, this is really vital, really important when we see the suffering in our world, especially as it's happening right now. Because if we don't achieve that realization ourselves, we can never help others to do that. So our motivation for engaging in this practice tonight is primarily, for the benefit of others, but the recognition that we have to increase our own realizations, our own knowledge, our own wisdom, or we will never be able to help others. And this is that mind of bodhicitta that is intent upon becoming a Buddha oneself, so one can then lead all beings to that same state. Okay, good. So again, in this course, what we did, those of you who might be newly joining tonight, we went through three main chapters of Nagarjuna's text, the three that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has taught on occasion, beginning with chapter 26. Chapter 26 is the one that demonstrates how we are caught up in this wheel of existence, going from life to life, with the primary root being ignorance, as I was just explaining in the motivation tonight. In chapter 18, which followed after 26 in His Holiness's way of going through this, we look at this topic of selflessness of the self, the person, which is what we're going to meditate on tonight. Of course, this being the way that we work on getting rid of the self-grasping, that is the ignorance that is driving us to continue to be involved in samsara, to continue to be unenlightened. And then the final chapter that we just concluded last week was chapter 24, where those two teachings, one on the conventional nature of things and how we're caught up in samsara, the other one on how we break free from that by understanding the lack of a self-sufficient, kind of independent, substantial self, this self that is at the root of all of our suffering, this inherently existent self. If we let go of that, then we come to know the two truths. the truth of ultimate reality, which is the truth of emptiness, which is what we're going to meditate on tonight. Of course, we are able to, within the sphere of that, uphold conventional reality to come to understand how everything exists within the sphere of emptiness, within the understanding of emptiness. So we're going to do a meditation on that, on dependent arising and how things actually exist, probably in next week's class. But tonight I wanted to work with the traditional way that we go through a methodology for understanding the lack of an inherently existent I, this I that is at the core of our um, it's the object that we are clinging to so tightly that is not there at all, doesn't exist at all. So we have to learn to refute it. Therefore, we have to engage in really vital analytical meditation. So let me begin sharing a few slides. What I'm doing for tonight's class is I'm going to use primarily this wonderful book that many of you have seen before, How to See Yourself as You Really Are, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So again, tonight we're going to go through this idea of realizing selflessness or emptiness, these terms being equivalent, but here specifically selflessness of the person, the I, using the 4-point analysis, especially again as it's described in His Holiness. So what I wanted to do first is refer to the very first verse, chapter 18, where this was initially brought out in our studies. If self were the aggregates, it would have arising and disintegration. If it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. So again, I'm not going to do a whole commentary on this verse, but this verse encapsulates two of the main conclusions that we come to that show the consequences of the self, the I, the inherently existent I, being equivalent, identical to the mind-body complex, what we usually call the aggregates, or it being completely different from the mind-body aggregates. So, and that's just a touchstone back to the text to show that this idea was introduced by Nagarjuna, of course, rooted in the Buddhist teachings in the Prajnaparamita, that help us to kind of move in this direction of this analysis. So, His Holiness and How to See Yourself as You Really Are explains in more detail that whole analysis that gets at realizing that this inherently existent I cannot be the same as nor different from, meaning inherently different from, the aggregates, the mind body. So it says here, there are 4 major steps toward realizing that you do not exist in the way you think you do. These are the 4 points of the 4-point analysis. The first step, His Holiness says, is to identify the ignorant beliefs that must be refuted. You need to do this because when you perform analysis seeking yourself within mind and body or separate from mind and body, and you do not find it, you could wrongly conclude that you do not exist. Again, this is what we were talking about throughout this entire course, was this whole idea of not falling into the either extreme, the extreme we are in to a larger degree now because we cling to things so tightly as having some eternal existence, some unchanging entity within them, an identity that is fixed within them. And when we begin to hear teachings on emptiness and even do analysis, we sometimes go to the other extreme being the extreme of non-existence, denying that things exist entirely, a nihilistic kind of bent. So again, we could potentially fall into that nihilistic view if we aren't really clear about what it is we're trying to refute, because we're not refuting that things exist at all, that the self exists at all. We're refuting a particular way that the self exists that we believe in that is contrary to how it actually does. So, because the I appears to our minds to be established in and of itself, when we use analysis to try to find it and it is not found, it seems that the I does not exist at all, whereas it is only the independent I, the inherently existent I, that does not exist. Again, this is getting at this whole idea that what we are really refuting is that sense that's mentioned in the last part of this, the independent I, the inherently existent I, the substantially existent I, the self-established I, the objectively existent I. There are many ways to talk about it. The I that exists by way of its own characteristics, the I that exists from its own side, and so on. So is really important that we get clear about what I it is that we are refuting, that we make sure that that is the target of this meditation. Again, because if we simply go in and say, I don't exist, well, the Buddha never said you don't exist. There wouldn't be much point to the teachings if you didn't exist at all. You don't exist in a fictitious way that your mind is clinging to so tightly and having that kind of misknowledge of the I. misknowing it and thinking of it in this fictitious way. So again, let's go back to what His Holiness is saying here in this part so I can go through these and we can actually do the meditation together. So he says then, because there is a danger here of stumbling into denial and nihilism, it is crucial as a first step to understand what is being negated in selflessness. So I'm going to go through each of the 4 steps as His Holiness initially presents them, and then we're going to do a little bit more kind of deeper understanding of how you actually do those, and then we'll do it together. So how does I appear to your mind? His Holiness says, it does not appear to exist through the force of thought. Rather, it appears to exist more correctly. You need to notice and identify this mode of apprehension. It is your target. So we have to kind of conjure up that idea of what does the I feel like when we are having that thought, that mistaken idea of how it exists. How does it appear to our minds when we think about the I, especially when we have a heightened sense of self that is arising in our minds? The second step, he says, is to determine that if the I exists the way it seems to be, again, because it does have that false appearance, it does seem to exist on its own, established by way of its own characteristics and so on, then if it does exist in that way, it must be either one with body and mind or separate from mind and body. So this is once more this understanding that we can come to logically, that if something is existing kind of from its own side, meaning that it is self-established, its identity is established on that basis out there that we are witnessing, then we should be able to find something that is equivalent to it. That unitary object that we are looking for, that is the I, we have a feeling of a single I that is here. We have to find a true referent of it. And the most logical place, again, to look would be the mind and the body, because that's how we kind of relate to an I, right? I mean, we don't think, that I'm in the other room now because my mind and my body are in the room. So I have a strong sense of an I in relation to this. So that is certainly the most likely possibility, is that if I'm going to find a true referent of that idea of an I, that thought of there being a real I, a substantial I, then the referent is probably going to be on this collection of stuff somewhere. I'm going to find the I to be here in a very solid way. If it exists in the way that it appears and that I think it exists, it should become very clear to me when I begin looking for it. But that's only one of the 2 possibilities. In the second step, we're wanting to make sure we delineate all of the possibilities so that we limit them to where we have to go analyzing, where we have to investigate. The second possibility is that somehow the I that we believe exists in this intrinsic way, in the substantial way, is something different than, apart from the mind and the body. Which once more, we don't have that general feeling, right? Again, I don't think that I'm in some other room in the house right now while my mind and body are in this room. We don't have that idea that naturally that the inherently existent I is something completely apart from the mind and body. But nonetheless, we have to refute that as well. Why? Because we want to exhaust the possibilities. And if we see that these 2 are the limits of our possibilities, either it is the same as or different from the mind and body, then we can be assured that if we look in those 2 places, we don't have a third place to look. So we do have to gain some certainty in the second step that isn't a third place. If I say, Don is in this room or Don is not in this room, well, then that's kind of both possibilities, right? Because if Don is anywhere outside of this room, he's, at the Whole Foods market, or if he's, out for a walk, or if he's in his bedroom, or whatever the case might be, then Don is in one of those places that is not in this room. If Don is in this room, then Don is in this room, and that's the first possibility. But anywhere else is Don not being in this room, being apart from this room, being in some place different than this room. So essentially, when we say that we're looking for these 2 possibilities, we mean that you're going to find this truly existent Don, this inherently existent Don, either to exist together with the mind and body or somewhere apart from that in the same way. So this is that second step. We have to do this to make sure that we've exhausted the logical possibilities of where this could exist. Then after ascertaining that there are no other possibilities, in the final 2 steps, you actually analyze to see whether the I and the mind-body complex can be either one inherently established entity or different inherently established entities, again, having their own way of setting themselves up, but completely apart, or being established together with what, the mind and body, so that they are inherently one, inherently identical. So this is the logic behind the second step. So then His Holiness says, as well as the third and fourth steps that was mentioned in the previous slide, through meditation, you gradually will come to understand that there are fallacies with I being either of these. At that point, you can readily realize that an inherently existent I is unfounded. This then is the realization of selflessness. So when going back to the previous slide, when you have kind of analyzed, go back to the very first one, you've identified the ignorant idea in terms of the self that you are holding to when that ignorance is present. Then again, to the second step, you determine where it might possibly exist, and you determine that it either has to be identical, one with the mind and body, or completely apart from, separate from the mind and body. Then you go look in those two places. The third step being to look at the mind-body complex and see whether it's identical, inherently one with the I, or it's inherently different. That would be the fourth step, to do that analysis. So again, you get to the realization of selflessness, you arrive at the conclusion that the I cannot be found in those ways. This inherently existent I, therefore, does not exist. That is what we mean by emptiness or selflessness, the lack of an inherently existent I. So let's go through these again in a little bit more detail in terms of what His Holiness says, and these are the steps that you're going to use in the meditation when we do it very shortly. In the first step, when we identify the target, there are 4 points that His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins, who assisted with this book, that they put out in the kind of meditation practice at the end of that chapter. The first one is to imagine that someone else criticizes you for something you actually have not done, pointing a finger at you and saying, oh, you ruined my party, or you ruined, the cake, or you ruined whatever. I mean, somebody who's accusing you of having done something that you know yourself you didn't do. So the sense of self that arises at that time seems so prominent and seems to be, um, quite substantial, quite real. And so this is the idea behind this first step, is that you do want to conjure up that strong sense of I in a very, very prominent way. So he uses other examples in his instruction. He says you could also remember a time when you were fed up with your mind, such as when you failed to remember something. We have that experience sometimes, right? Where we go, oh, I believe I forgot that my mind is such a mess, and you feel like this strong sense of self that is feeling offended at the way that your mind has not remembered. Or you might even have a time when you're fed up with your body, some feature of your body, like, your hair or whatever. That's another example that he uses in this. Remember a time when you did something awful and you thought, I really made a mess of things. These are, again, times when these strong emotions cause us to have this uprising of this sense of self. It's not to say that it isn't there the rest of the time, but it feels so much more prominent then. It's more noticeable then. Another example, remember a time when you did something wonderful and you took great pride in it, because there can also be positive experiences we have where we have that strong sense of self, but we feel very prideful, very full of ourselves at that time. And then finally, remember a time when something wonderful happened to you and you took great pleasure in it. Again, a more positive experience, but nonetheless, one that the strong sense of I is there. We feel at those times that there's this reality to the I that, again, we get quite caught up in. And sometimes when we have those various states of the mind being quite prominent, we do have delusions that follow from that. The pride that might follow, that can become destructive, or the anger at someone else when they've accused us falsely, and so on. So again, this is to try to identify, not go back to those experiences and relive them, but to identify the feeling of I that seems so real at that time. I point this out often for me when I think about times when I'm defending myself. If someone has said that I did something and I know I didn't, it feels kind of right here in my chest. You can't maybe see it on the screen, but it's kind of like right here in the center of my being. It almost feels physical. This kind of reality of an I, a place from which I'm kind of coming from to defend myself. Again, fiction, all fiction we're going to see as we go through this analysis. That false sense of self is what we want to refute. It's often called the object of negation or refutation. The second step then is watch your reaction when you remember that particular event when the I felt prominent. And then the question, how does the I appear to your mind at that time? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? And then the question, how does the I appear to your mind at that time? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In what way are you apprehending it? What is it appearing like? In What are your thoughts about it if you're kind of examining at that time? Again, see how much you are imbuing it with a reality from the side of your mind. And then notice how that I seems to stand by itself, seems to be self-instituting, established by way of its own character. So again, these are the steps that we'll go through in just a moment when we do the meditation. But that first step, they say, is the most important, because if we, if we correctly identify what it is that we are searching for, just like if you say you were in a large group, prior to the pandemic, you're at a concert or something, there are all these people around, and suddenly you reach down and you notice that, your phone's been stolen, or your wallet or purse or whatever's been stolen. Well, if you don't have a clue as to what the thief looks like, who's taken that, good luck finding, in that crowd, the person who took it. So you have to have some idea of what the thief looks like, what the sense of I looks like. That is a real thief. It's robbing us of our happiness. It's keeping us in a state of suffering. But the idea here is that if we don't clearly identify that, we won't make much progress. And if we do clearly identify it, all the texts say that then we'll have an easy time of the rest of the meditation. The second step is determining the choices. As I said earlier, we want to determine what possibilities where that real I might exist. First, we analyze whether the I that is inherently self-established, or seeming to be so, in the context of the mind-body complex, could have a way of existing other than being part of or separate from mind and body. Again, those two possibilities in relation to the mind and body. First examine, well, is it possible that it would have a way of existing other than being part of, being kind of identifiable as one with the mind-body complex or some part of it, or completely separate from the mind-body complex? So see that there is no third category of existence. So by virtue of that analysis, recognize that there isn't a third possibility, that they are either the same or different. Either the inherently existent I is equivalent to the aggregates, the mind, body, or complex, or some part of the mind or body, or completely different from. There's no third possibility. Just like if Don's in the room or Don's not in the room, there's no third possibility. If Don exists, he's got to be in one of those two places, right? Either he's in here in the room, doing his teachings on Zoom, or he's in another room goofing off, So the third step in this is to decide that if the I inherently exists as it seems to, it must be either one with or separate from mind and body. So make that decision. So there's not many steps involved in this. We can probably do this rather quickly, but we have to come to that conclusion that there are only two choices, only two possibilities. The third step is to analyze oneness. So consider the consequences if the I that we're thinking of, again, if it is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears. So if this fictitious I exists, and if it is also then the same as mind. So there are consequences to this, and we're going to go through these consequences. If we have time, we'll also do the kind of analysis to see whether we can find that I. That's also a useful tool. But the consequences are worth taking a look at, because we see how illogical it is to think that this I exists, because if it did exist in the way that it appears as that real, that substantial, then we would have these consequences. These would ensue from that. First, the I and mind body would have to be utterly and in all ways one. In other words, this unitary sense of I and all the things that we have in relation to how I think of I and how my mind and body are would be utterly identical. They would be absolutely the same. And there are consequences. Again, this is the starting point for the consequences, and then you have things that follow from that. In that case, if they're identical, asserting an I would be pointless, right? Because you wouldn't need to say I in relation to it, because the mind-body complex are already I. The third point, it would be impossible to think of my body or my head or my mind. Why? Because the mind and the body are you. So who is the I that has the feeling of possession of those various aspects of our being? Fourthly, when mind and body no longer exist, the self also would not exist. Of course, we do say that the self of this life, that who we identify as, that kind of temporary self, does go out of existence when the mind and body of this life go out of existence. Of course, mind carries on, the subtlest levels of mind going forward to our future rebirths and so on. But essentially what we're saying here is that there would be no self at all. Self would be completely annihilated when mind and body of this life no longer exists, which of course isn't the case. There is a self that continues on from life to life because the basis for that self continues on, albeit not a concrete, substantial self. But again, these are the ramifications if it was concrete and substantial. When mind and body go out of existence, the self goes out of existence. The fifth consequence, since mind and body are plural, right? Everyone agrees mind and body are two phenomena. They actually are related phenomena, but they are actually very different. Mind being non-material, body being material, form. So if they're plural, then one's person's selves would also be plural. So I would have two I's. I'd have the I that is the body and the I that is the mind. So they could do two different things. You have two different people here in a sense. My mind is doing a different thing while my body's doing something else. And then also we could look at the opposite. Since the I is just one, mind and body also would be one. So because we have a sense of a unitary I, that there aren't more than one eyes here, in this capital I, not the eyes like that we use to see, because there's just one sense of I, then there must be only one findable basis. So mind and body would have to be one, which we know is absurd. There's a seventh one, but I'm not going to go through that tonight because it gets a little more complicated. It has to do with that idea that was verse about arising and disintegrating. But we would see that there'd be consequences of the self coming in and out the same way that mind and body do, which was similar to what we saw in that one point. But so we're going to go through those steps, and we're also going to again do the short analysis to see whether it's possible for us to find that sense of I among the aggregates, the body and mind. Then we should hopefully come to the conclusion, if you've done the correct analysis, that you haven't found it there. You go on to the fourth step to analyze difference. Consider the consequences if the I is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears to our mind. So we do find it to be real in that way. And it's also inherently different from mind-body, meaning completely, utterly separate. We do say that, let me just pull off screen here for just a second. We do say that the I and the mind-body are two different phenomena because the I is what we label to. We're going to go into this next week when we do the meditation on dependent arising, but it's what we label to the mind and body. So the mind and body are the basis upon which we designate a sense of I. So in that way, we have to say that they're different because I is the label and what's being labeled are the body and mind. But nonetheless, what we're talking about here is inherently different, meaning completely unrelatedly different. Whereas in this way that things actually do exist, the way that the I and all phenomena actually exists is as dependent arisings, merely imputed, merely designated upon a basis. So when we see that, there is, that this is the reality of things, we recognize that things can't be utterly, inherently different, because then they would be totally unrelated. And that's kind of the flavor of all these consequences when we look at them. So let's go to those, and we see that the first consequence is that I and mind-body would have to be completely separate. You could not find them to have any sort of joint relationship, a relationship like I just described. You couldn't have one be the cause for the other in any way. They would have absolutely no relationship, be completely separate. In that case, I would have to be findable after clearing away the mind and body. And this is how we'll do that meditation, kind of imagining clearing away the mind and body, get them out of the way. You should have I left over. The I should be there, able to stand on its own, completely independent of the mind and body, because that's this second way that we're examining is complete inherent difference, complete unrelated difference between the mind body and the I. Thirdly, the I would not have the characteristics of production, abiding, and disintegration, which is absurd. Because as we, come into existence and have various things happen to us and the changes in this body, you would have an I that wouldn't have those characteristics while the body is going through all of that. As our body changes or as our mind thoughts disintegrate, new thoughts arise and so on. All of that would not be happening within the sphere of an I because they're only happening to the mind and body, and the mind and body are separate from the I, utterly separate. Fourthly, the I would absurdly have to be just a figment of the imagination or permanent. Because we have this sense of an I being that separate, well then it wouldn't have any kind of, again, relationship to the mind body. It would have to be totally made up, the I having absolutely no basis in any kind of reality. And again, we don't say that it has a basis in inherent reality, but it certainly does still exist. The I does exist as that label we put on the aggregates, or permanent, or some sort of unchanging thing that is totally apart. Similar to what they say, in terms of the Atman, the self that was taught in the Vedic traditions around the time of the Buddha and continues to be held, that there's some sort of soul, some sort of permanent essence of who you are that is completely independent of the body and mind. So it would have to be that type of thing. But again, we don't find that type of I at all. The sense of I we have isn't permanent and unchanging. It is changing all the time. And then absurdly, the I would not have any physical or mental characteristics, because again, those physical and mental characteristics are reserved for the body and mind, and the body and mind and the I are totally separate, totally different. So this is the idea behind this. Let me go through this real quickly. Well, actually, let's do the coming to a conclusion. Yeah, let's go through that, and then we'll do the meditation. I think we'll still have a fair amount of time. Once you engage in analyzing in this way, you will begin to question the strong sense of a self-instituting I that earlier seemed to exist so palpably. You will gradually start to think, aha, previously this seemed to be so true, but maybe it really isn't. This is the point of this meditation we're going to do, is that you want to arrive at a place where you say, at least begin to question that I, because you started to investigate it. You see that it doesn't exist in the way that you did. Then, as you analyze more and more, you will become convinced, not just superficially, but from the depths, that such an I does not exist at all. You will pass beyond mere words and gain conviction that, though it appears concretely, it does not exist in that way. This is the imprint of extended analysis, as Holiness says, a decision from within your own mind that this sort of I really does not exist. And then finally, by meditating and gradually cultivating these 4 steps, you will develop an ability to examine anything and everything this way. We're going to do it with regard to the I, which is how it's generally taught, but you can do this with regard to any phenomenon. Seeing the conflict between appearance and reality, and deciding from the depths that persons and things do not exist the way they appear. What is understood by that completely decisive mind is the absence of the inherently existent I, even though you used to believe in it so strongly. You totally understand the negation of inherent existence. Your mind becomes absorbed in that emptiness. Okay, so let me stop the share here. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions. It's about 7:26, so we have maybe just a few minutes till we want to start the meditation. Um, any questions on what I went through? Again, I realize I went through it a little bit quickly, but hopefully some of you are already familiar with this meditation. And we're going to go through it. So we're going to actually do it tonight together, so you get a chance to kind of taste what this meditation is like. Okay, no questions. All right, let's go ahead and do the meditation then. So what I was thinking initially about putting the instructions on the screen when I was going through them, but I think what I'll do is I'll just lead you in those, and that way you don't get distracted by the screen changing or whatever, and we can review all those. And again, I'm going to make all of that into a handout that we can post. Mary will post that on the website at the Dropbox connected to this class, so you can go in, hopefully have that to her by tomorrow sometime. So within a day or two, you should be able to find that handout there, and I'll clearly mark it as the 4-point analysis. There's also a meditation that the FPMT put together that is very similar to this. It won't be exactly what I'm using, but it'll be a part of it in terms of the idea of analyzing the mind and body and seeing whether we find the I in that. That's more the orientation of that meditation. So let's just find a good posture to do some meditation in. Again, make sure that the back is somewhat straight and upright. And we're going to begin with just a few minutes of watching the breath. Again, you can do whatever technique works for you in working with the breath. And I'll just leave you focus on the breath for a few minutes. Again, if the mind wanders away from the breath, bring the mind back to the breath. So now before we begin the meditation, let's just refresh our motivation for doing this. As I said in the motivation tonight, it's essential that we develop this wisdom within our own minds. If we are ever to benefit other beings, if we are ever to be free from our own dissatisfaction, our own imperfection, we have to realize emptiness. Therefore, we're going to engage in this meditation tonight with that aim of being able to realize emptiness through planting the seeds for that. By meditating on emptiness tonight and continuing to do that, we will eventually realize this profound truth. We do this not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. So again, we're going to do these 4 points, beginning with the very first point, which is so essential, to identify the target, the object of negation. So the very first instruction is to conjure up that strong sense of self. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we can do this by imagining that someone else is criticizing you for something you have actually not done, making that false accusation, pointing a finger at you even, and saying things like, well, you ruined this party, you ruined my birthday, you ruined my life, whatever the case might be. But somebody who is kind of accusing you of having done something that you know in your heart you didn't do. Again, if that one doesn't work for you so much, choose one of the other examples I mentioned. Thinking of a time when something really difficult was going on, another scenario, or something pleasing and delightful, but the strong sense of I. Try to identify that, to feel that. Don't relive the whole scenario, or don't, make it into a huge emotional thing. Try to keep your eye on the target. How does the I appear at those times when you feel falsely accused, or when you feel prideful, and so on? Just take a moment to do that. Again, try to get very clear about how that I is appearing. When you recall or think about that possibility of someone falsely accusing you. But also see, how are you apprehending it? What is going on in your conceptual mind in terms of how you are thinking about the I at that time? Can you begin to see that false way that we are adhering to the I at that time to have some real, substantial, independent existence? Try to notice how that I that you're causing to appear, that you're conjuring up, how it seems to stand by itself, seems to be self-instituting, established by way of its own character. existing from its own side. Again, all these ways of describing it, but get a real feel for this sense of I that at those times, certainly, and even other times in our life, but at those times in particular, feels so real, feels so substantial. So then seeing that it has that characteristic, or seems to, of existing in that way from its own side, by itself, self-established, self-instituting, we should be able to find something that is it then, that is the true referent of that. It should have that substantial reality. So what are the possibilities for where we might locate such an I? If that I were to exist in the way that we've just caused it to appear, that again is there quite naturally in our minds, where would we find it? What are the possibilities? What are the choices? So again, we obviously have a strong sense of this I in relation to the mind-body. This is certainly one possibility. If it exists in that real way, in a self-established way, we should be able to either find something on this mind-body complex, some part of the mind-body complex. We should be able to locate something that is equivalent to the I, that is identical to the I, one with the I. Or the second possibility, that if it's not locatable there, well then perhaps it exists as something completely separate, inherently separate, utterly separate, independently separate from the mind-body complex. So again, see if you can see the logic of those two possibilities to begin with before we examine if there's a third. Does it make sense that if the I were to exist in the way that it appears, that it would be either one with the mind-body complex or separate, different from the mind-body complex? And then, of course, ask if there is a third possibility. Is there a third category of existence, a third way that this real I could be found to exist as neither one with the mind-body complex or different from the mind-body complex, something completely outside of the realm of those two possibilities? Is there a third possibility? Is there some way that this real I could exist that is not one with the mind-body complex, not completely, utterly different from the mind-body complex? And then come to the conclusion, the decision, that if this I exists inherently, as it seems to, as it appears to, especially in this scenario that I've conjured up, that strong sense of I, then it must be either one with or separate from mind and body. We don't find this inherently existent I to exist in a third way. Only two choices, only two possibilities. So then let's take a look at these two possibilities. And again, throughout this, you might have to reconjure up that strong sense of I we did in the first step. It's important that we keep going back to that. make that quite prominent in our own minds, that strong sense of I when we feel falsely accused, or when we're in danger, or when we feel great joy or happiness that's extreme. The strong sense of a self that seems to rise up on those occasions even more prominently. This is what we're trying to find, a true referent of that, because it seems to be true. It seems to be real. It seems to exist in the way that it appears. So the first way that we want to analyze this third step is to analyze oneness. Can we find it to be one with, identical to, the mind-body complex or some part of the mind-body complex? So let's look at the consequences of that first. If they were one, if the mind-body complex was one with the I, the inherently existent I, well then they would have to be utterly and in all ways one. It would always be equivalent to the mind-body complex. The I and the mind-body complex would never have any differentiation. They would be utterly one. Again, examine from your own experience if this is how the I really exists. Does it exist as inherently one with the mind-body complex so that they are utterly the same? And if that were the case, that they were the same, well, then we'd have a lot of other faults. Asserting that there is an I at all would be pointless because there's already the mind-body complex. If it's equivalent to the I, then mind-body complex would be enough to demonstrate that there is the I. You wouldn't need to even use the term I. It would already be established as I from its own side. This isn't, again, how we think of the I and the mind-body complex. Furthermore, if the inherently existent I were one with, identical with the mind-body complex, well, then it would be also kind of pointless or even impossible to think my body, my mind, my head, my thoughts, because there would be no separate I that is possessing the mind, the body, the thoughts, which is once more contrary to how we experience things. We often think, oh, my head is hurting, as if the head is something possessed by the I. Well, if the I is real and inherently one with the body, well, then we wouldn't have an ownership of the head. We wouldn't have an ownership of the body or the mind or anything else. The I and the mind-body complex would be the same. We wouldn't be able to even differentiate those into two different thoughts. My body, my mind. And furthermore, the consequence that if they are again utterly the same, the inherently existent I equivalent to the mind-body complex, then when the mind and body cease, which at the end of this life, our body ceases to function, our grosser levels of mind connected with that body cease to function. When all of that ceases, the self would be annihilated. There wouldn't be any sense of self continuing on. Even though some subtle level of mind goes on, the self would die with the aggregates, the mind and body of that life. But again, this is not how it's taught, not how we come to understand. There's a self that is arising after this life, the continuity of that mind at the subtlemost level that goes on to another existence. So again, another consequence for you to think about based upon that concept, that the mind and body, when they no longer exist, would thereby annihilate the self-existing because they are equivalent, they are identical. And then the next consequence is this idea that if we examine what we mean by mind-body complex, we see that there's a plurality there. The idea of complex seems to be a singularity, but it's a complex of mind and body, two different phenomena. And we further divide the mind into the other four aggregates, making the five aggregates of form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. If we use that format as well, then we see that if there's a plurality of things in the mind-body complex, then there's a plurality of eyes. If the I is inherently one with the mind-body complex, then there are many eyes. There is the I that is my form, my physical body. The I that is my mind, and again can be further divided up into a number of eyes. The I that is my feeling, my discrimination, my compositional factors, my consciousness. Do we find that to be logical, that there can be, two or more eyes here? We don't have that experience. The I seems to be singular. So contemplate that as well. And then because we have that strong sense of the I being singular, we'd have the other consequence. If the I is in this inherently existent I has a singular quality, then because it's equivalent to the mind-body complex, well then that has to become unitary, which also is absurd because we know it is not a single phenomenon. It's a complex. It consists of everything that is mental within our being and everything that is physical within our being. So how could it be a unitary phenomenon equivalent to the I that is unitary, seemingly unitary? Again, just try to work another minute or so with that consequence. But again, recalling that strong sense of I that we're looking for. And if it is identical to the mind-body complex, then all these faults ensue, all these consequences that don't make sense, that don't seem to fit with our understanding of conventional reality. So then let's do the other part of this meditation in regard to trying to find that inherently existent I to be one with the mind-body complex, which is to go looking for it, which is an interesting exercise in and of itself. Once more, conjure up that strong sense of an I that we did in the first step. It feels so real. As I said, for me, sometimes it feels to be right in the center of my chest. Well, let's start by examining the body. If I were to open my chest, a surgeon to kind of like cut through my sternum and go looking in there, do we find that inherently existent I to be somewhere there in the body? Do we find it to be equivalent to the head, to the heart, to any other part of the body? Just go looking and see if you can find a true referent of that strong sense of I that is equivalent to the body or some part of the body. And see if you can locate it. And we might want to think that the entire body, the whole of the body, is equivalent to this inherently existent I. But once more, what we mean by body is a uh, label we give to all the various parts of the body. So then there would have to be many, many I's here if it's equivalent to the body. Same consequence we saw earlier. The I that is the head, the I that is the torso, the I that is the heart, the I that is the lungs, the I that is, whatever we choose in terms of all the various parts of the body down to the smallest cells and what have you. Well, again, we can do that analysis, but do we find the I to exist equivalent to the entire body? No, because of that consequence. So then let's examine the mind. Again, there's in our mental landscape many different things. We have our 6 main consciousnesses, our eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then finally the mind, mental consciousness. This mental consciousness is where we spend a lot of our time thinking, all the various thoughts that arise. It's the processor, in a sense, of the mind. First of all, examine, is this inherently existent I, again, conjuring up that strong sense of an I, equivalent in all ways, absolutely identical to one of these consciousnesses, equivalent to the mental consciousness, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body consciousnesses? Can you find one of them that is equal in all ways to that I, the true referent of that thought? Then examine other aspects of the mental landscape, your feelings, the feelings of pleasure, the feelings of pain, all the various other thoughts you have, all the various other aspects of the mental terrain, our virtuous minds, our non-virtuous minds. Can you find anything in this realm of mentality that is equivalent in all ways to the inherently existent I? It is identifiable as absolutely being the I in that way. We might even investigate this subtlemost level of mind. As I said, there is a continuity of mind that goes from life to life. We call this in the tantric teachings the clear light mind. Well, is that equivalent to the I? It would have to be identical in all ways, meaning that we could never experience anything but that as our sense of I. So we would never have any identification of the body as I, which is what we frequently do. If we see a photograph of our body, we say, oh, there I am. Well, that wouldn't be possible because it's not a photograph of our clear light mind. Our clear light mind is not equivalent to the body in any way, but yet we identify with the body. So even the clear light mind that goes from life to life cannot be the I in this inherently existent way, equivalent in all ways to that I that we have such conviction in, that we think exists substantially. So after having examined the body and the mind and taken it all apart, both of these phenomena, and tried to see if we could find something within them that was equivalent to the I, we might still think, yes, but there is a real I here because the mind-body complex is here. Identifying that as a unitary phenomenon, but it is not a unitary phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that exists of at least the two parts of body and mind, as well as the multitude of parts that exist within each of those. Complex is simply an idea we have to bring two things that are different together. Body and mind are different, not inherently, but conventionally different. Mind, again, being non-material, non-physical. Body being physical form. A complex is just a way of bringing these two things together. It doesn't have any substantial identity as a unitary phenomenon. So our unitary I that we firmly believe in could not be equivalent to the complex. So even with this step, we might stop and examine, is there anything else that we might examine on this cushion, the body, mind, the body-mind complex, some part of the body or mind. We may not have exhausted all the parts, but we should be pretty confident that we've looked at enough of them to know that we haven't found the I in that way. It doesn't exist inherently as one with the body, the mind, any part of the body or mind, or the mind-body complex. It's not here on this cushion. The inherently existent I cannot be found among the mental and physical aggregates. So then we have one more step, though, because we had that second possibility. The fourth step is to analyze difference. So consider that if this I existed inherently in the way that it appears, what would be the consequence if it was utterly different, absolutely inherently different from the mind-body complex? Mind-body complex on one side, the I existing inherently on another side, having its own established identity. Well, then there would be no relationship between these two. The inherently existent I would exist entirely on its own, with no relation whatsoever to the mind-body complex. It would be utterly different and separate. Again, just test initially to see if that's your experience. Do you feel that way? Do you feel, again, that there's some sort of I, when you conjure up that strong sense of I that we did in the first step, that feels utterly, absolutely, inherently different from the mind-body complex, totally separate from them? One of the consequences we saw is that the I wouldn't have the characteristics that the mind and body have. It wouldn't be produced and abide and disintegrate, kind of continue to change. While the body and the mind changed, the I wouldn't change at all in accord with what's going on with the mind and body, because it's not related to the mind and the body. It is utterly different from the mind and the body because it's inherently existent, cannot be related. And if it existed as inherently different from the mind-body complex, furthermore, it would end up being a figment of the imagination or some sort of permanent phenomenon, unchanging, because it doesn't depend upon causes and conditions, doesn't depend upon the way that the body and mind arise and so on. It would be completely independent. So it would either be permanent, unchanging, which again is denied by the experience we have. We don't have the experience of an unchanging I. Rather, we don't think we're the same I that we were when we were 15 or 2 or some other age. Or it would be a complete figment of the imagination. It would have no basis in reality at all because it's completely unrelated to the mind-body complex. And then lastly, think about the consequence that there would be then absolutely no physical or mental characteristics that we could attribute to the I, because the I exists inherently independent of the mind and body, although the body might be 40 years old or 50 years old or 60 years old. We would never say I'm 50 years old, 40 years old, and so on, because it's only the body that's that age. the I is completely unrelated to it, has none of the characteristics of the body or the mind. Or if our mind was very confused, we would never say, I'm confused, because it's only the mind that's confused. The I is independent of that and is not confused. And does that make sense? Can we see the absurdity of these consequences? If the inherently existent I was completely, utterly independent of the mind-body complex. And then we want to do a bit of an investigation in the same way we did with the third step of looking for the inherently existent I to be one with the mind-body complex. Let's look for it to be completely different from the mind-body complex. So we do this very simply. Imagine in your mind right now that you've taken your body and mind off of the chair or cushion that you're seated upon. Put it in another room. Mentally remove it from this space. The mind-body complex is gone. Is there an I remaining on the cushion or chair? If the I existed utterly, completely apart from the mind-body complex in that inherently existent way, then it would be left over. We'd be able to find it completely separate from the mind-body complex. It would have no relation to them whatsoever. Do you find an inherently existent I on your cushion when you mentally remove the physical and mental components of your being, the mind-body complex? So hopefully then you've come to the conclusion on this fourth step that the I, if it exists in the way that it appears as independently, inherently existent, cannot be utterly different from the mind-body complex either, because then it would become a completely separate phenomenon, totally unrelated. And we also saw in the third step that it cannot be inherently one with the mind-body complex because we would have all the other consequences. Moreover, we simply do not find any part of the body or mind, or the body, mind themselves, or the complex of the two to be equivalent to that I. We don't find a true referent of that sense of I that seems so prominent when we are falsely accused and so on. Therefore, because there is no third possibility, and we have refuted the two that are the choices we have, we end up with the negation of this inherently existent I. We cannot find it. It doesn't make sense for it to exist. It's illogical. Therefore, all the thoughts of that I, such as what we were conjuring up, feeling falsely accused, they're based on ignorance, based on an understanding that is incorrect, believing the I to exist in this way when it actually exists contrary to that. It only exists by virtue of being named, merely designated, merely labeled onto this mind-body complex. So the I does exist. We don't arrive at a nihilistic conclusion, but we arrive at that emptiness that is the negation of this fictitious way of existing. And holding on to that negation, try not to let it wander into nihilism by remembering that the I still does exist, albeit in this mere nominal way, not having anything more than being merely designated. And just try to rest in that realization of emptiness as best as you can at this time for a minute or two. Okay, so again, hopefully that's given you some taste of this meditation. This, of course, is being recorded, so you can always go back if you did find this somewhat useful, to review again. But in all the Lamrim texts, again, all the stages of the path texts, this is the main meditation that is set out to realize the emptiness of the I, the sense of self that we are clinging to so tightly. By going through those 4 points again to identify very clearly that strong sense of self that we are trying to refute, that is the object of our ignorance. It's what the ignorance is grasping onto as if it did exist, and of course it doesn't. The second step to determine the possibilities, the choices, where if it does exist in the way that it appears, and it has to be findable. You have to find something that is equivalent to it, that is identical with it in whatever way, either identical to the mind-body complex or identical to or kind of one with something that is completely different. So you have to find it to be utterly different or find it to be completely identical. And we don't find either of those choices when we go through the third and the fourth step. Recognizing that there's no third possibility, we come to the conclusion that it doesn't exist. It is empty of inherent existence. The I is empty of being an inherently existent I. The I still exists, albeit again in a very, very slight way, very nominal way. So I hope this was useful. Again, I'm going to continue to do 2 more meditations on emptiness the next 2 Wednesdays. The next one I'll do is on dependent arising, because we'll come back to understanding how the I and other phenomena actually do exist, being established through the various levels of dependent arising. So again, know that we do have posted in the chat box right now all the various things that are coming up, some of which I announced before we started. But yeah, keep in mind that we do have a number of things that we've added. You're welcome to join all of those. Again, tomorrow being the next event with the digital embrace from 12 to 12:30. And Nancy's facilitating that, Nancy Savoya. So thank you, Nancy, for doing that. All right. So again, reach out to care@tnlsf.org if you need any assistance with anything, and keep an eye on the website for the upcoming events. But do look in your inbox for today's announcement around April. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and do the prayers. Okay, so excuse me. Let's go ahead and do the dedication prayers that are on the screen now. The first 2, where we dedicate all the merit that we've created by turning our minds towards the subject of emptiness tonight, and doing a meditation on it. That we dedicate this so that we can achieve Buddhahood eventually, having real emptiness directly. We can completely remove all of our obscurations and achieve that state. And then in that state, lead all sentient beings to attaining Buddhahood as well. And then the second verse, where we recall bodhicitta, this amazing mind that we are constantly trying to keep fresh in our own awareness, to use as a motivation for everything that we do, so that we can then further that mind, develop it very deeply in our own hearts, and inspire others to do the same. So let's recite those 2 prayers with those thoughts in mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme dual bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then we'll do the three prayers that are on the screen for these three teachers in our tradition. But as we recite them for these three specific teachers, think that we're creating the cause for all spiritual guides, those that we have karma with, as well as those that others have karma with, even in other traditions, that if beings are benefiting from their presence in this world, from their guidance, giving them good tools to work with in terms of morality and accomplishing their own happiness, then may they have good health and long lives through what we've done here today, and may all beings have perfect guides in all their lifetimes. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And then let's dedicate for all those beings that we're holding in our hearts. Certainly at this time, what's foremost in our minds are all those beings who are dealing with this epidemic around the world, those who are succumbing to the virus, especially those who have died or who are in great sickness right now. And also think about all those on the front line who are responding to this, all the medical professionals who are struggling so hard to keep up with the caseload, especially in so many of these hotspots in this country and around the world, as well as all the other people who are contributing to the welfare of beings by helping them during this time of the pandemic. Pray for the good health and long lives of all these beings. And all of them may have true happiness and peace. And then also include in your thoughts and dedications anyone else who you know who is experiencing illness or obstacles, experiencing dying perhaps right now, or who has died recently. Bring all those beings to mind as well. If they're beings that you have in your heart, you have a karmic connection with them. So it's important that you dedicate for their welfare. Thinking that through the power of what we've done here tonight, may these beings be free from their suffering and attain true happiness and peace. And may all beings attain perfect happiness through what we have done here. All right, thank you all so much. Again, I will be online tomorrow night with the Taoist group doing the Finding Calm in the Storm. And I will, be also here on Friday afternoon for the Guru Puja. So those are the events coming up in the next few days. But again, keep an eye on the schedule for the rest of them. And everyone, please take care, be safe, be healthy. And I'll look forward to seeing you all in person sometime in the future. So, all right, good night.